Good evening, everybody. We begin tonight with a major national security development and the rising tensions between the United States and Communist China. The Federal Communications Commission today designated Chinese telecom companies Huawei and ZTE as national security threats. The FCC also barring U.S. telecom companies from using federal subsidies to buy equipment and services from those Chinese companies. FCC Chair Ajit Pai today saying that both Huawei and ZTE have close connections to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, adding that ZTE and Huawei are required to turn over data and information that they collect to Chinese intelligence. The FCC's designation comes as Beijing tightens control over Hong Kong, putting into effect a sweeping national security law that completes Beijing's takeover of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, supporting that takeover and the end of civil rights in Hong Kong. Pro-democracy groups say this is the end to the Hong Kong the world once knew. On Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the United States is stopping the exports of defense equipment to Hong Kong. The State Department also imposed the same restrictions on defense and dual-use technology. Last year, the United States exported more than $75 million of military equipment to Hong Kong, most of which was in the form of engines and turbines. $3.5 million, though, marked as tanks, artillery, missiles, rockets, guns, and ammunition. Secretary Pompeo said, quote, "We cannot risk these items falling into the hands of the People's Liberation Army, whose primary purpose is to uphold the dictatorship of the CCP by any means necessary." Guest this evening formally designated Huawei and ZTE as threats to U.S. national security. His declaration, a major step toward removing national security threats from the United States. Joining us, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai. And Ajit, good to have you with us. It's been some time since we knew that both of these companies were turning over information that they gathered in the course of their normal businesses to the People's Liberation Army, to Chinese intelligence. Why this decision now?
Well, thanks for having me on, Lou. Unlike in communist China, we have the rule of law in this country. And in November of 2019, the FCC proposed to ban the use of FCC funding being used by telecom carriers here in the United States on problematic equipment or services coming from carriers like Huawei and ZTE. We initially proposed to designate Huawei and ZTE as national security threats, but we allowed everyone to make their case. We heard from the executive branch, we heard from Congress, we heard from other stakeholders, and we heard from Huawei and ZTE. The overwhelming weight of the evidence was suggested that Huawei and ZTE would be national security threats. And that's why we moved forward today with a firm designation to plant a flag to say that going forward, starting on July 1st, tomorrow, that USF funding overseen by the FCC, will not be allowed to be used by U.S. telecom carriers on equipment or services from these two companies, which do present a national security threat to the United States.
Is this effectively the beginning of pushing both of these companies out of the U.S. Market?
That's a good question. All I will say is that we are looking at overall the security of our communications networks. Right now, we're talking about communications networks that are funded in part by the FCC. Last year, we also opened up a conversation about whether we should broaden that prohibition for equipment or services that are used by networks, even if they're not funded by the FCC. We've also been working with Congress on so-called rip and replace legislation to finance the removal of problematic equipment. To us, at least, the bottom line is no matter what company it is, what country that company is located in, if it's compromising the security of the United States' communications networks, that's not allowable. We will not allow that to happen on our watch.
So Huawei and ZTE are being barred as well, then, from access to the backbone of the internet, to our basic telecommunications infrastructure. Is that correct?
That's correct. What we found was that these two companies, Huawei and ZTE, had ties to the Chinese Communist Party, had ties to the Chinese military apparatus, the People's Liberation Army. And in addition to that, they are obligated under Chinese law. If they get a request from the Chinese secret police, the intelligence services, they must comply with it, and they are prohibited from disclosing the fact of that request to any of their customers. So especially if you're talking about small rural carriers in the United States, it's not a risk that we believe is worth taking. That could allow for all kinds of intrusion, the installation of backdoors, the infection of our networks with malware, the theft of intellectual property. There are all kinds of risks that are simply not worth taking here in the United States, and I would argue elsewhere in the world.
And indeed, in terms of the rest of the world, Ajit, where does Europe stand? Where do our allies in the Pacific and Asia stand?
Well, I can tell you, based on my own personal conversations with some of my foreign counterparts, we've gotten a good response from many of our allies around the world. I've talked to folks from South America, Europe, and Asia, and I think that those conversations are starting to have traction. Recently, Singapore, for example, took a step with one of its major carriers to limit Huawei use installation of 5G equipment. Just yesterday, the Indian government banned 59 Chinese-based mobile apps, including companies like TikTok, from their networks altogether. I think there's a growing recognition around the world that the Chinese Communist Party presents a unique threat to communications networks. And here in the United States, we are sending a signal that we are not going to be able to tolerate that threat any longer.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Ajit Pai, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, which today has changed the world a bit in going after both ZTE and Huawei. Few leaders on the political right are willing to stand up to the mob. Instead, they're allowing the left to continue their support of the radical agenda. Last night, the Democratic National Committee took things past their normal garden variety stupidity. In a tweet, the DNC took the official position that celebrating the 4th of July at Mount Rushmore is the equivalent of celebrating white supremacy. Did I mention we're talking about the Democrat Party? The tweet has since been deleted, but without explanation or apology to the President of the United States or the American people. And we're not going to wait on that, are we? Members of the radical House Democrats today received a White House briefing following New York Times reporting that Russia had paid the Taliban to kill our troops in Afghanistan. The New York Times reporting depended on anonymous sources, reporting that was knocked down in today's intelligence briefing. President Trump, the White House, the Pentagon, the Director of the National Intelligence, all dismissing the New York Times report. And they've denied that President Trump was ever briefed on those charges. A conclusion that House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer today seemed to agree with.
I also agree with John Bolton, who said it was inconceivable from his perspective that there is not a cause for briefing on this matter of such importance. Apparently that did not happen. I left the White House with the impression, and the president has said he was not briefed. Leave it at that.
And leave it at that. The Democratic Party may do that, but it is not its typical course, is it? The Democrat Party has managed to destroy its already diminished credibility. They once again look inept and clownish in their efforts to still attack President Trump. Listen to them today as they struggled to withdraw from their assertions that President Trump had sat on information about Russian bounties.
Nothing in the briefing that we have just received led me to believe it is a hoax. There may be different judgments as to the level of credibility.
As we look at these, and I'm going to call them allegations because I can't confirm or deny any underlying intelligence.
Perhaps the president knows something, perhaps he doesn't know anything, perhaps he reacted a certain way, perhaps he doesn't or didn't. It just makes no sense at all.
No, the left make no sense at all. They look silly, clownish, and as usual, inept. The left-wing national media kept playing the pink poodle to the sinister and silly radical Dems today. even as their absurd fictional Russian bounty narrative blew up in their faces. What is the deal with the Democrats and Russia? Don't they ever learn? So far, they haven't. CNN and the New York Times both claiming unnamed sources to report that President Trump was briefed on those bounties. And the Associated Press made more claims without facts that John Bolton had briefed the president as early as last year. All fake news, all lies, all as usual. Breaking news now, the Senate Rhino trio of Mitt Romney, Lindsey Graham, and Marco Rubio have introduced together in hopes of reining in President Trump's ability to remove troops from Germany. Romney saying, quote, "The withdrawal of U.S. troops from Germany would be a gift to Russia, and that's the last thing we should be doing," end quote. This Rhino Trinity clearly ignoring what the president said about the topic just last week.
We're going to be reducing our forces in Germany. Some will be coming home and some will be going to other places, but Poland would be one of those other places in Europe. I think it sends a very strong signal to Russia.
A strong signal to Russia. The president also being called upon by many to move many of those troops to Poland, which would actually put them in greater proximity to Russia. Romney and Rubio and Graham are, again, clownish. And they didn't even explain how the president's plan to move our troops closer to Russia would be a problem for us. I don't think that they're doing too well in foreign policy. Joining us tonight, our guest says the New York Times has blood on their hands for even publishing the fictional Russia bounty story. He's Congressman Jim Banks, member of the House Armed Services Committee, an active officer in the Navy Reserve who served in Afghanistan. Congressman, great to have you with us. This is just more idiocy from the New York Times. At some point, you would think they would become somewhat embarrassed by their unnamed sources and their propensity to report absolute claptrap.
You would think so, Lou, but obviously not. This is a despicable hit piece by the New York Times published on Friday with one clear intention, and that's to damage President Trump as we get closer to Election Day by rehashing the Russian-Trump collusion hoax narrative that the American people have grown so tired of. The Democrats, on the other hand, they took the bait. They jumped the gun on Friday, and it's confusing, as you've already mentioned, to keep up with them. On Friday, they were attacking President Trump because he might have known about it and he didn't do anything about it. Today, they walked out of a briefing and they're attacking him because he didn't know anything about it. It's confusing. It's hard to keep up with. It's despicable. Yeah. And the American people have had enough of it.
Well, just keeping a straight ahead look at True North. The New York Times is a left-wing propaganda arm of the Democratic Party, the radical Dems. They have given themselves over to pure nonsense. And by the way, if I may disagree with you on this, I don't think the American people are confused at all. They know what a silly, inept lot these Dems are right now. And by the way, if they want to rehash the idiotic Russian collusion story, I say bring it on. Do as much of it as you can, New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, CBS, whomever, because the American people realize that that was entirely a conspiracy to overthrow the President of the United States. It was Spygate. It was an effort to stop his candidacy and then to overthrow him when he won the presidency. And they were as inept at that as they are everything else. Then they tried impeachment. Why not? Let's bring it back. I mean, let everybody just wallow in what stupidness, has enveloped the entire Democratic Party. They're a silly lot.
I couldn't agree more, Lou. This piece, though, in the New York Times on Friday, the worst part of it is now the Russians know what we know. Maybe the intelligence was good, maybe it wasn't. We don't know that, and that's why the president was never briefed on it. The intelligence was never verified. But the bad part about this is now our career intelligence officials in the field who are doing their jobs might not ever be able to find the truth, because the Russians would be, if it were true, the Russians are literally shredding the evidence. If it's not true, the Russians are laughing at us because once again they've worked with the New York Times and the Democrat Party to sow discord in the United States of America. And that's what's despicable about it. For me personally, I served in Afghanistan, did 50 vehicle convoy missions outside of the wire during the time that these bounties were allegedly in place. That means the bounty was on my head, and that the Democrats and the New York Times have prevented our intelligence community from doing their job to get the facts and track this down so that we can hold those responsible accountable is absolutely shameful.
Yeah, it is shameful, and even if the intelligence is, is what it appears to be, completely absurd. The idea that we wouldn't know what is being done, and the idea that the Taliban needs some further incentive to try to kill our soldiers, does that not, as one who has served there, Congressman, doesn't that seem a little silly to you that the Taliban needed a little boost from the Russians to want to kill Americans?
Well, we might not ever know, because a leaker went to the New York Times.
No, I just mean on the face of it.
But you're right. They don't need more incentive. But we might not ever know the truth, because the New York Times published a story on Friday that revealed classified, sensitive information that was shared with them from a leaker. And that's what's so astonishingly wrong with this story. It was all a hit piece to attack the president. And I'm sick and tired of it. I want the leaker to be held accountable, and I want the New York Times to be held accountable for that as well.
Let's see. Now this is what's interesting. Was there a leaker? Because this is, again, unidentified sources, unnamed sources, anonymous sources. Who the hell knows who it was? It could have been any number of people. But what is troubling to me is 3.5 years into this president's first term, we still have leaks that can be this noxious and this just, well, as you say, somewhat annoying. Congressman Jim Banks, as always, it's great to have you here. We appreciate it. Thank you. Jim Banks. Up next, why does the national left-wing media accept Joe Biden's bunker mentality that keeps him in his basement most of the time? Historian Victor Davis Hanson joins us next. Stay with us. Breaking news now. A new Rasmussen poll finds 1 in 5 Democrats say Joe Biden has dementia. My next guest has written about Biden's cognitive decline as he sees it, and Biden's bunker mentality, he says, is only delaying the inevitable. Joining us tonight is Victor Davis Hanson, a brilliant historian, senior fellow in military history at the Hoover Institution, professor emeritus of classics at California State University, author and National Review contributor. Victor, great to have you with us. This is a strange time for the national media in so many ways, but their efforts to ignore what is obviously a bunker mentality on the part of Biden, and emerging once every 85 days for a press conference, and then when he does, to make mincemeat and hash out of his verbal attempts at verbal communication.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting, Lou, because a lot of us had said that the moment he emerged after this long sojourn, that it would be a reason why he shouldn't ever do it again. And in his first moments, the first thing he said is, "You're a lying dog face." And that was, from that point on, I mean, he got the prompts confused, where he was supposed not to tell the audience that he had pre-selected people that were to call on him. And he had long pauses, he had loss of stream of thought, and he should have stayed in the bunker, because he was trying to frame, and his handlers were trying to frame this election in a very strange way. It was going to be Donald Trump versus the media version of the virus, the lockdown, the rioting, and the looting. And as long as he was able to maintain that media version of those events, he had Donald Trump had gone down, and he'd gone up. And then with a wink and a nod, he more or less said that his vice president would be a woman of color. He said woman, but we think it will probably be a woman of color. And by association, that person will be the next president should he be elected. And that was going to pacify his base. And as long as he did that, he didn't have to sign on to debates. He didn't have to campaign. He didn't have to come out with an agenda that was contrary to Trump's. He didn't have to circle the square of his views versus his hard left, likely VP. And then suddenly, I think the pressure became so much that his handlers thought, you know, people are criticizing us. We've got to get him out, and we'll prep him really well. And it didn't work. The longer somebody that has cognitive impairment, the antidote to that is stimuli and getting out. It's not staying in for weeks on end in seclusion. It makes it worse, and we saw that yesterday.
It is also, you wrote in the National Review about the politics of dementia, but there is another serious, very serious issue here that the left-wing national media is ignoring. And that is, if indeed he does have dementia, and certainly there are troubling signs, this is abuse of the elderly. I mean, by any definition, it is abuse of someone who is impaired. And I don't hear a single person in the left-wing media, anyone in the Democratic Party saying, what in the world is going on? This is an issue of humanity and humane treatment. Where in the world are the people who care for this man?
Well, Lou, remember how he got there? He had bombed out for the very reasons that you just outlined in January and February of this year. And then people were frightened that they thought Bernie Sanders would be their socialist nominee, so they brought in Mike Bloomberg. He turned out to be $1 billion disaster, and they had no one else, so they resurrected Biden and more or less coerced Buttigieg and Warren and Booker to get out, and then they were back to square one, and they never really thought. They avoided Sanders, but they created a new condition of a candidate that people had been worried about, their own voters, because he was cognitively impaired. So they're back to square one, and this is highly ironic because in American history we've had Woodrow Wilson in a comatose state the last year of his presidency. We had FDR that everybody knew when he ran for a fourth term in '44 that his vice president would shortly become president, and they got him off the ticket, Henry Wallace, because they knew that he was basically a communist or a socialist, and they wanted Harry Truman. And so we've been there before, and it doesn't end well. And it's very ironic because you remember, Lou, just a year and a half ago, the left and the media said that Donald Trump was cognitively impaired. There was no evidence, but he took the Monterey cognitive assessment test. They had a Yale psychiatrist, I think her name was Bandy Yee. She testified before Congress and said that he should be restrained, but none of that is happening now. Biden said he takes tests, and he said he takes them frequently. All he'd have to do is do what Trump do and release the results, or have Dr. Yee or somebody like that from Yale come back and examine him the way that she did in absentia with Donald Trump.
It is extraordinary. Your judgment about the impact. We're reporting tonight on what is happening in 3 cities, Seattle and Portland and New York City and in other cities around the country. And that is more disruptions, civil unrest, more protests and demonstrations, often turning violent. What will be the impact on the election, in your judgment, as we wrap up here?
Well, the people very quickly, they want it over with, and they're going to do one of 2 things. I'm talking about the swing voters and the independents in these key states. They're going to want it over, and if Donald Trump takes control, and he's got a lot of people that don't want him to. He's got the military that's hesitant. He's got the blue governors. But if he can get some federal indictments, cut off some federal funds, coerce these blue state governors to do their job, then they'll vote for him. And if he has a press conference like he did with COVID, with Barr here and Cuccinelli here and his national security advisor, and reassuring the Americans that today we did this and tomorrow it's going to get better, he'll win. If he doesn't, then the American swing voter will go into a fetal position, Lou, and he'll say, make it all go away, and he'll come to the wrong conclusion and think that Biden's victory will pacify the left when, in fact, it'll only encourage them. but that's the choice. And I think he's done a lot better the last 2 or 3 days. Keep quiet,
Right.
stay calm, use a brilliant attorney general, get federal indictments. One thing we know, Lou, is that when the police act in Seattle or when they act in Washington to save a statue, these so-called courageous protesters and rioters and arsonists, they dissipate. They don't go up in the hills as if they're guerrillas like Che Guevara. They're worried about their CVs or their record, or they don't want to go to jail. So when they're met with force, they react accordingly, and it's not very heroic. So I think the police were exactly right. If you do it today in Seattle, why didn't we do it 2 or 3 weeks earlier? And the answer is that the blue state mayors and governors weaponized this issue of law and order because it was an election year, and the chaos they thought served their electoral purposes.
This president is always at his best when he does what he thinks is right, and when he is owns the high road. He has both, I think, in hand. Victor Davis Hanson, always great to be talking with you. Come back soon.